The political chaos in Ottawa couldn't have come at a more challenging time. The government is bracing for U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's return to office, with his threats of massive tariffs and jabs at making Canada the 51st state by annexing this country using, quote, economic force.
In the early days of his second term, President Donald Trump brought back one of his most unexpected and controversial ambitions, to make Greenland part of the United States. It wasn't a new idea. He had floated it back in 2019 during his first term, when the notion of buying Greenland from Denmark sparked laughter across the globe and stiff rejection from Copenhagen. But by March 2025, Trump wasn't joking. From the podium at a joint session of Congress, he raised his voice with conviction. "We will annex Greenland to the United States, one way or another." That bold line drew applause from some and stunned silence from others. It echoed a deeper shift in Trump's foreign policy, symbolic conquests over slow diplomacy. In his November 2024 victory speech, he doubled down on unfinished business from his first term. A steel wall on the southern border, peace in Ukraine in one day, and yes, Greenland, not as a distant dream, but as a concrete objective. What he didn't see coming was Canada. Just days after Trump's fiery declaration, two relatively unknown Canadian mining firms, Greenland Resources and Amaroq Minerals, finalized a $3 billion deal with the government of Greenland, the Kingdom of Denmark, and the European Investment Bank. The agreement would greenlight new rare earth and gold mining operations across the southern edge of Greenland. Trump's vision of planting the American flag on the icy island was suddenly met with an unexpected and very real obstacle. Canada, quietly backed by European capital, had beaten the United States to Greenland's most valuable assets. This wasn't about maps or flags anymore. It was about minerals, energy, and control over Arctic infrastructure that could reshape future trade routes and global defense postures. The race for Greenland had already begun, and Trump's team, stuck in old playbooks, was late to the table. After his return to the White House, the National Security Council dusted off two Cold War-era documents, one from the Eisenhower era, mapping Arctic gaps in radar coverage, and another from the 1980s about upgrading the Thule radar station in northern Greenland. The idea was to use these old frameworks to push for a military and territorial foothold. Quietly, Pentagon officials argued that Russian submarines were hiding in a radar blind spot north of Greenland, one that could threaten America's Arctic surveillance capabilities. But the louder argument from Trump's side wasn't military. It was economic. Public surveys had already revealed Greenland's massive reserves, billions of tons of rare earths like graphite, zirconium, and niobium, plus up to 17 billion barrels of Arctic oil. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley said it bluntly, "If we don't mine these resources, Beijing will." From the administration's point of view, it was about national economic security. But Greenland's response came swiftly and sharply. In a joint statement on March 12th, Greenland's government and Denmark's royal cabinet declared that Greenland's sovereignty was not up for negotiation. "Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders," Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said. The message wasn't just for Washington, it was for NATO. The statement warned that any forceful territorial move by one NATO ally against another would undermine the very foundation of the alliance. It was a diplomatic red line, delivered in calm language but reinforced by Europe's financial and political muscle. And behind that red line was a much bigger shift. Greenland had already begun reorienting itself toward Europe. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2023, required that at least 25% of rare earths used in the EU be sourced from allied countries, and from mines that meet human rights and environmental standards. Greenland, under its red-green coalition government, was eager to meet those terms. They just needed money. That's where Canada stepped in. Greenland Resources, a small Canadian firm once sidelined on the Toronto Exchange, had quietly built a relationship with European steelmakers hungry for molybdenum, a rare metal essential to industrial steel. With help from Denmark's Export Credit Agency and a green fund from the European Investment Bank, the company secured a 30-year license for the Malmbjerg site. Then came Amaroq Minerals, a newer player listed on stock exchanges in Toronto, Reykjavik, and London. Amaroq focused on reviving the long-dormant Nalunak gold mine. Backed by fresh capital from British pension funds, Danish public funds, and Norwegian state investments, the company launched one of the Arctic's most ambitious mining ventures in recent years. Even U.S. private equity quietly joined the funding, despite Trump's aggressive public stance. By the time Greenland's parliament approved both projects in March 2025, the U.S. had lost its first-mover advantage. Canadian and European money, not American boots or legislation, were shaping Greenland's future. The minerals, gold, and high-conductivity metals would flow to Europe, not through Washington. Trump's team, caught off guard, shifted gears. The State Department floated a new proposal, development aid in exchange for U.S. base rights. Denmark rejected it outright. Meanwhile, Canada played it cool. The Trudeau administration avoided loud speeches or provocations. Instead, they stitched together a quiet network of partnerships. Greenland's mining laws, Europe's clean energy goals, and long-term infrastructure investments, all led by non-U.S. institutions. And it didn't stop there. The Canadian Ministry of Finance joined forces with the European Development Bank and Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund to establish the Arctic Green Transition Fund, a $3.1 billion pool for infrastructure projects in Greenland. No American institution was invited to the table. Back in the U.S., frustration boiled over. Defense firms like Lockheed Martin warned of project delays due to a potential shortage of key metals like molybdenum. Senators from Alaska and Vermont raised environmental and diplomatic concerns about Trump's aggressive approach. Meanwhile, U.S. investors were, ironically, buying stock in the very Canadian companies the administration was trying to compete with. By April, a new map published in the Toronto Press made the situation crystal clear. Canada's Arctic hexagon. It showed a development corridor stretching from northern Canada to Greenland, bypassing U.S. control but connecting resource hubs, tracking facilities, and green energy routes. Trump's Greenland obsession hadn't just fallen flat. It had been overtaken by a coalition he couldn't control. The real power was no longer in Washington's hands. It was quietly being exercised by middle powers, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the EU, through economic integration, shared ownership, and local sovereignty. And while Trump continued to insist, "We will make Greenland rich," the island had already chosen its partners, and none of them spoke from the White House podium. By the time the mining licenses were approved and the Arctic Green Transition Fund was announced, a deep chill had spread through diplomatic circles in Washington. Not the icy weather of Greenland, but the frost forming within NATO. Trump's rhetoric, built on American exceptionalism and hardline national security, now ran directly against the interests of longtime allies. The March 2025 joint statement from Copenhagen and Nuuk made it clear: Greenland was not for sale, not for lease, and certainly not for coercion. But Trump didn't flinch. If anything, he pushed harder. The Pentagon began floating proposals for flag demonstrations in the region. One such plan involved Lockheed C-130 aircraft landing at Thule Air Base under the guise of joint training drills. Another idea was to station missile tracking personnel under a temporary NATO exercise designation. Neither plan involved actual combat, but the goal was unmistakable: establish physical presence and normalize it over time. Within Washington, opinions split fast. The Pentagon favored low-visibility engagement. Trump's inner circle, however, kept calling for more visible strength. His new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, told reporters that failing to act in Greenland would leave the door wide open for China and Russia. The problem? Europe didn't see it that way. France, in particular, moved in the opposite direction. President Emmanuel Macron greenlit a rapid deployment of French development banks to fund a new international airport in southern Greenland. The French Navy also ramped up patrols in the North Atlantic. The message: Europe supports Greenland's autonomy and sees it as a partner, not a pawn. Norway, despite its usual alignment with NATO strategy, also began pushing back quietly. Its state pension fund had already invested millions in Amarok minerals. That fund, one of the world's largest, rarely takes political risks. But this time, it was staking its money on stability, in Nuuk, not Washington. Meanwhile, Poland stayed silent, caught between its defense partnership with the US and its EU obligations. Warsaw decided to wait. It wasn't alone. At the June 2025 Vilnius Arctic Summit, the air was tense. NATO members disagreed not just about Greenland, but about what kind of military presence was acceptable in the Arctic at all. Trump's idea of annexation wasn't just undiplomatic, it was destabilizing. Several European ministers warned off the record that pushing too hard could lead to an internal NATO crisis. Back in Canada, the mood was very different. Ottawa had played its cards carefully. No loud speeches, no grand declarations. Instead, Canada focused on results. Greenland had the minerals, Europe had the need, and Canada had the financing and engineering know-how. It was a clean fit. Ottawa's security briefings noted another critical point. If the US moved too aggressively on Greenland, it could reignite old disputes about the Northwest Passage. That icy corridor, running through Canadian waters, has long been a point of legal disagreement between the US and Canada. Trump's pressure on Greenland risked dragging that issue back into the open. Ottawa wasn't about to let that happen. Instead, they doubled down on what they called an Arctic buffer strategy. Part of that strategy was establishing multi-party ownership over Greenland's infrastructure. Not just Canada, not just Denmark, but a web of investments that made it politically costly for any one country to take unilateral control. The $3.1 billion Arctic Green Transition Fund was a perfect example. It included Canadian federal support, European green bonds, and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. But noticeably absent was any American institution. It was an intentional exclusion, designed to protect Greenland from US influence. In Greenland itself, the impact was already being felt. A new law, the Infrastructure Phallic Bill, passed the local parliament in July 2025. It raised the local employment requirement for mining projects from 50% to 70%. It also mandated that 10% of profits be diverted into a future fund, modeled after New Zealand's Maui model. The goal was long-term local wealth, not just short-term foreign extraction. Both Canadian companies accepted the terms. They had no choice, but more importantly, they had no reason to object. The fund promised long-term political stability, a goldmine in the investment world. American firms, on the other hand, hesitated. Washington's long-standing refusal to accept revenue-sharing mandates made it unlikely that U.S. companies would meet the conditions set by Greenland. This widened the gap even more. While Trump kept talking about making Greenland rich, the island had already found its preferred path and its preferred partners. And the minerals themselves were more than just shiny metals. Greenland's molybdenum, for example, was vital for heat-resistant steel, nuclear reactor pre-coatings, and even hypersonic missile tips. With rising geopolitical tensions, demand for these metals was skyrocketing. The EU had even identified them as Tier 1 priority materials in its 2025 Blue Hydrogen report. That put Washington in a bind. Trump's Inflation Reduction Act, tied to domestic EV production, didn't anticipate a Greenland squeeze. Molybdenum wasn't central to batteries, but it was crucial for structural components and heat shields. Suddenly, a minor Canadian mining project in Greenland was holding up timelines for U.S. defense contractors. Lockheed Martin quietly announced that some of its hypersonic test schedules might be delayed. Raytheon hinted at shifting supply chains to Australia and Chile. But that takes time, and the more time passed, the more leverage Greenland gained. On Capitol Hill, even some Republicans started pushing back. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska warned that any armed conflict in the Arctic would be a disaster for our ecosystems, our allies, and our credibility. She wasn't alone. Democratic senators from Maine and Vermont proposed a mining partnership framework between NATO allies to avoid conflict. It went nowhere, but it sent a message. Trump's unilateralism wasn't universally supported. Meanwhile, Greenland's new parliamentarians, many of them young, climate-conscious, and pro-European, began advocating for permanent economic independence. Not necessarily full political independence from Denmark, but financial self-sufficiency through high-yield, ethically managed resource projects. In private, Danish officials admitted that Greenland's current path gave them leverage too. As long as Copenhagen helped facilitate Greenland's EU ties and green financing, they could maintain influence without imposing control. It was a delicate balance, but it was working. Trump's team, frustrated and increasingly isolated, tried a final play. They offered Greenland access to U.S. technology and military infrastructure in exchange for closer security ties. But Nuuk, supported by Copenhagen and Brussels, declined once again. The message was simple: we'll trade with you, but we won't be absorbed by you. By late summer 2025, a clear picture had formed. Greenland, once seen by President Trump as a symbolic prize, a chance to expand America's borders and project strength in the Arctic, had become something very different. Not a battleground, not a bargain, but a case study in how small and medium powers can bend global strategy using quiet capital, smart alliances, and local empowerment. What began as a Trump declaration, "We will get it one way or another," had spiraled into a costly geopolitical standoff. But not in the way the administration expected. There were no invasions, no treaties, no emergency UN sessions. Instead, Greenland was methodically locking in a future built on economic partnerships, not political subjugation. And at the center of it all were Canadian companies, backed by European money, pulling resources not just out of the ground, but out of America's reach. One of the sharpest turning points came in the energy sector. While Washington's eyes were fixed on radar coverage, missile tracking, and territorial symbolism, something more practical was happening off Greenland's coast. Canadian company Cedar Energy began negotiating a deal with European gas buyers for a floating LNG conversion plant in Disco Bay. Liquefied natural gas from Arctic sources had long been considered too expensive or technically risky. But the technology had improved, and Europe, eager to reduce its dependence on U.S. gas, especially after Trump placed new restrictions on LNG export permits, was ready to invest. The plant wasn't massive by global standards, but its message was clear. Arctic energy could now bypass Washington entirely. Canada and Greenland were connecting directly to Eurasian markets. No American intermediaries, no U.S. regulation. The German government moved quickly to support the project. Still reeling from its messy break with Russian gas in 2022, Berlin saw Arctic LNG as a new diversification route, a way to reduce vulnerability not just to Russia, but also to the political volatility of U.S. leadership. It was a quiet vote of no confidence in Trump's global energy policies. Meanwhile, another quiet crisis was forming inside U.S. defense circles. The Pentagon, already scrambling to find new sources of critical minerals after Greenland slipped away, had classified molybdenum and rare earth metals from the island as high-vulnerability assets. For American contractors, the consequences were immediate. Delays in delivery of high-grade alloys, scheduled disruptions in aerospace programs, and perhaps most worrying for the Trump administration, an increase in European leverage over U.S. defense timelines. In early September, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon submitted parallel memos to Congress, warning that without stable mineral access, their long-term contracts for hypersonic systems and advanced satellite hardware could fall behind. Quiet lobbying began. The message: this wasn't just a diplomatic misstep. It was a material threat to U.S. military readiness. But by then, the ground had already shifted. Greenland's future fund was operational. Mining profits were being split under new legislation. Local employment was growing. Danish and Greenlandic officials were working together to balance autonomy and coordination. And most importantly, trust had been established between Greenland and its new economic partners. Trust built not on military deals or vague promises, but on equity, environmental standards, and clear revenue sharing. Even U.S. financial institutions, which had initially stayed out of the Arctic rush, were starting to feel the pressure. Hedge funds in New York and Boston quietly bought minority stakes in Amarok minerals and Greenland resources through European proxy firms. They didn't want to miss the upside, but they couldn't join directly without clashing with Trump's executive orders on Greenland-based entities. The contradiction was sharp. Publicly, the administration still talked about reclaiming Greenland. Privately, American capital was already playing catch-up in a game Canada had started and Europe had funded. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, officials were exhausted. Trump's Greenland push had stretched the alliance's ability to manage internal friction. Norway had taken Denmark's side early on. Poland stayed neutral. Germany leaned quietly toward Greenland's economic independence. France played its usual game of asserting leadership while protecting commercial interests. Even Canada, typically a soft-spoken partner, had begun to assert itself more openly. Ottawa's position was clear: coercion in the Arctic would not be tolerated, even from allies. And with Canadian capital now directly invested in Greenland's energy and mining future, any American military action would risk direct fallout with its northern neighbor. The final blow came in October 2025, when a report leaked from the Arctic Legal Observatory, an NGO specializing in sovereignty and treaty law. It detailed how any unilateral military occupation of Greenland by the U.S. would almost certainly trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty, given Denmark's full membership status. Trump's team responded with typical bravado, insisting no invasion was being planned and that all options were on the table. But insiders knew the reality. The costs had become too high. There was no legal path forward, no political cover, no international support, and worst of all for Trump, no economic gain. Because in the end, what had looked like an easy win on the campaign trail, a forgotten island, barely defended, rich in minerals, had turned into a strategic loss. Not just a loss of territory, but a loss of influence. And the world had watched it happen. Greenland is now at the center of a new Arctic architecture, one defined by local control, multilateral funding, and long-term sustainability. Its resources are locked into a web of European and Canadian commitments. Its laws reflect the priorities of its parliament. and its future looks nothing like the vision outlined by Trump. From the outside, it might seem like a small story. One island, a few mines, a handful of contracts, but the ripple effects are enormous. Trade routes are shifting, energy alliances are recalibrating, middle powers are rising, not with tanks, but with spreadsheets. And Arctic politics, once the domain of Cold War generals and spy satellites, is now being shaped in boardrooms and local assemblies. For Trump, the Greenland chapter will be remembered as a warning that not every prize can be claimed with force, that in a world of connected economies, flags mean less than contracts, and that while America still commands immense power, it can't always bend others to its will. Not when the others are ready, not when the deals are done, and certainly not when the ice has already cracked beneath their feet. What do you think about this issue? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. If you found this story informative, don't forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on bold, real-world stories like this one. Thank you for watching.